Delighted to be here and follow up on Shoshana. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing, looking at embodied carbon, primarily around concrete, but also specifically around pavements, since we are talking about infrastructure here. And although I'm going to talk about embodied carbon, I'm also going to talk about it in the context of a life cycle perspective. So at least the motivating factor for a lot of the work that we do is that if we're going to be quantitative about sustainability assessments, we should use a life cycle perspective and also look at trade-offs among performance, costs, and environmental impacts. And of course, when we're talking about performance, we need to remember that we've chosen to create this bridge or this pavement because it serves some function for society. And when we're talking about costs and environmental impacts, we should use that life cycle perspective. And the reason that it's important is because there are many different opportunities to lower environmental impacts when you're using concrete. In materials production, anything you can do to use recycled content or improve energy efficiency associated with production or improve material performance could help. In design and construction, anything to use less material or create longer lasting designs could really help. In the use phase, I'll talk about how the way we design and maintain pavements affects fuel consumption. The reflectivity of pavements can affect the urban heat island effect. And also concrete pavements can absorb carbon dioxide. So all of those are important factors. At end of life, anything we can do to enable material recovery is important. And also end of life is also an opportunity to increase carbon uptake. So the important thing is that these are all things that can be done, but we need to look at trade-offs among them so that we're not just focusing on one when it could be at the expense of some other impact that happens later in the life cycle. So generally, when we talk about embodied impacts of structures, we're usually referring to materials and then design and construction, whereas the whole life is the complete picture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out first talking about embodied impacts and primarily about concrete. Now, the thing, probably most of you know that, concrete is a mixture and we use all these different constituent ingredients here to make our concrete mixtures. But I think one of the things that people forget is that we create a mixture to meet many different performance requirements. You usually hear people talk about 28-day strength, which fits within this late strength category here, but sometimes early strength is important. Some of these other factors can also be key players. So there's almost like infinite number of different combinations we can make here in order to meet those different requirements. I've also intentionally used this word binder here because there are many different binders that we can use in concrete. Probably the one that people hear about the most is Portland cement. But there's also natural pozzolans, there are calcined clays, there are even different versions of Portland cement that we can make that have kind of different properties and different environmental impacts. There's also different kinds of waste materials. Fly ash and granulated slag are the most common ones, but people are also creating products from post-consumer glass. A key thing to know, though, is that we can't always just do one-to-one substitutions of these materials. The composition of them, their performance when we mix them with concrete, and the availability can vary significantly. So we can't always just do one-to-one replacements. Now, when it comes to concrete's environmental impact, what we can first do is look at what's the mass breakdown of those materials that are in the concrete. What you can see is cement makes up, in this case, about 13%, whereas most of the impact, around 80%, comes from the aggregates. But when we look, right, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. When we look at the breakdown of the environmental impact of concrete, what we can see is that mass of cement is around 13%. It's around 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions of producing that concrete. So cement is what's really the driver there. Now, fortunately, there are many different solutions available today for lowering cement and concrete's environmental impact. On the cement side, there are different things we can do associated with how we produce it, from using different kinds of fuels or improving the energy efficiency, and also different types of blends of cement that we can make that have a lower environmental impact. Probably one of the most noteworthy ones is what we call Portland limestone cement, which has about the same performance as ordinary Portland cement, but has lower environmental impact. On the concrete side, there are many things we can do as well, and they're primarily about optimizing the mixture of the concrete to meet performance-based specifications, and within that, trying to minimize environmental impact. There are some other things that are exciting about using, either capturing carbon at the cement plant or using captured carbon in the creation of concrete and aggregates. But those are starting to be used, but are a little bit further down the line. Now, the barriers to adopting those are usually risk aversion and cost. And I really list those in that order because, a lot of times these don't have to have significant additional costs. But, engineers are a pretty risk averse bunch. And as someone who uses buildings that are made of concrete and, drive on pavements and bridges, I appreciate that risk aversion. But of course, if we're ever going to take any significant action when it comes to climate change, we're going to have to do things differently. So dealing with this risk aversion, I think, is one of the foremost challenges. All right, now kind of going to that whole life perspective, I wanted to talk about a few things particularly related to pavements and why this life cycle perspective really matters. And what I'm going to start with here is actually looking at a breakdown of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for urban interstate pavements in Missouri. And this chart here is showing an asphalt pavement, and this is showing a concrete pavement. And what you can see in this breakdown, this red here is the impact associated with materials and construction. Blue is future maintenance and rehabilitation. Green is end of life. And the rest is the use phase. And when we do this life cycle assessment of these pavements, that use phase is made up of a couple different things. One is excess fuel consumption due to pavement vehicle interaction. And so it turns out that the stiffness and roughness of pavements affect the amount of energy dissipation in the vehicles. And if they're not particularly stiff or they are particularly rough, then there's additional fuel that has to be consumed by the vehicles driving on them. So that's included in this. So is carbonation, that is the amount of carbon dioxide that's absorbed in the pavements, along with the amount of lighting that's required in some pavements because the reflectivity of pavements affects that. So what you can see is, at least for these urban interstate pavements, that use phase is really the key driver. But what I'm going to do is take a deeper dive into this materials and construction phase first. What you can see, once again, on the asphalt side here and the concrete side. On the asphalt side, what's interesting is that, the bitumen, which is the binder for asphalt, it's a relatively low fraction of the environmental impact. It's mostly transportation and construction. Whereas on the concrete side, the cement is what's the real driver, which is kind of similar to what I showed you earlier. So anything that we can do to kind of change the binders that we use is really going to help on the concrete side. And as I mentioned, those Portland limestone cements are one solution, or other supplementary cementitious materials. Now, if I take a dive into that use phase component, at least for this particular analysis, the excess fuel consumption is what's really the driver. For the asphalt pavement, you can see the roughness is a pretty big driver, but deflection also matters a lot. That's the part related to stiffness, or what's the structure of the pavement, whereas this has to do with the roughness. On the concrete side, you can see the roughness is much more dominant. And that's primarily because, asphalt's a viscoelastic material. And so the stiffness properties can vary with time and temperature. And so they tend to be just a little bit more susceptible to that deflection component. Other elements of the use phase that I wanted to talk about, I alluded to this a little bit, but through the process of carbonation, concrete can absorb carbon dioxide over its life. And here's kind of the chemical reaction that occurs, and it's been studied for quite a while because of reinforcing bar. It was often thought of as a durability concern. But it turns out people started to look at it a bit more from the context of climate change and CO2 emissions, and started to look more at how can we understand that a bit better. And it turns out there are several different factors that affect the amount of carbon uptake through that carbonation process. What's the exposed surface area? What kind of concrete mixture was used? What's the climate? And also, what's the end of life treatment? Turns out because that surface area really matters, at end of life, when you're done with it, if you crush the concrete, you expose more surface area and you can drastically increase the amount of carbon uptake. So one of our teammates, Hassam Azari Jafari, who I think is here, a postdoc working with us, he ran some numbers for the whole concrete pavement network. And what he found is right here. This is the US concrete network, and I'm going to show you right here. This is just for the concrete pavements in the US pavement network. And this blue part right here is the amount of carbon uptake that would be expected during the use phase. So just, when the flat top surface of the pavement is exposed, whereas green is the amount that we could expect when we're crushing up concrete at end of life. And you can see the uncertainty right here as well. And you can see there's much larger uncertainty associated with the end of life number, even though, on average, it's not too different than the use phase. But that's because it really depends on what type of a treatment that you do at end of life. But still a pretty interesting bottom line number here that you can offset about 5% of the clinker GHG emissions from this carbon uptake. Another interesting factor when it comes to end of life is, that you can recycle concrete. So there's a lot of things that you can do with what we call recycled concrete aggregate. There's about 150 million tons of recycled concrete used in the US annually. You can use it again to make new concrete, but you can also use it in asphalt pavements. You can use it in soil stabilization applications and also in road bases. So there's a lot of opportunities for that. So what I'm going to close with is actually sharing with you some numbers that we've run as part of some research where we were looking at what kind of opportunities are there for concrete to help achieve a greenhouse gas reduction targets. And as part of that, Hassam, who's on here, he led these analyses. And what we did is we made some estimates of what are historical pavement GHG emissions, and this is the total pavement network in the US, and then did some projections looking at some different scenarios. We looked at a projected set of scenarios, that is where we would keep doing kind of like business as usual, increasing fuel economy of vehicles, increasing use of recycled content. And then we also looked at some ambitious activities, which, like they sound, were much more ambitious in terms of increased investments, which would lead to more activities where we could get smoother pavements, stiffer pavements, higher reflectivity. And so you can see is these actions right here with the P are the projected actions, things that we could do, improving the fuel efficiency of the vehicle network and lowering emissions associated with materials production. These are other things here associated with a more ambitious scenario. And you can see the breakdown here. One of the things that's interesting, at least in the US, we talk a lot about interstates, but you can see there's so much more impacts on other, even including local and collector roads as well. So what's interesting is that if we can achieve all of these reductions, we'll actually meet about a 68% greenhouse gas reduction target, or 65 million metric tons compared to 2016 levels. And that's about the target that we're trying to meet with the Paris reduction goals. So that's interesting, but of course it does require more ambitious actions. The other thing that we wanted to look at is basically, what if we focus specifically on only the pavements where treatments were done? Whereas what I showed before was associated with the entire pavement network. What if we focus just on those newly treated pavement emissions? And we wanted to look at what's the breakdown between what we call those embodied impacts and the use phase under a couple of those different emissions. So these shaded areas here show those projections into the future. You can see embodied emissions here and use phase. And over that total period, you can see the embodied emissions are about 30%, whereas use phase is about 70-ish%. These lines here show under the more ambitious targets quite a bit less, but what's interesting, the big breakdown is still the same. So it's clear that that those use phase emissions are really going to dominate. So we have to definitely try and lower embodied emissions, but we have to do it in the context of that full life cycle. So just wrapping this up to summarize, what are these key target areas for reducing environmental impacts associated with pavements in general, and also with a specific focus on concrete? On the materials and production side, anything we can do to increase the use of supplementary cementitious materials, Portland limestone cements, other blended cements is going to help. On the asphalt side, reducing construction impacts and increasing use of recycled content is going to help. Reducing transportation distances also. On the use phase, increasing pavement stiffness, decreasing pavement roughness, and increasing pavement reflectivity are really going to be the big hitters. And at end of life, anything we can do to increase carbon uptake and increase the use of recycled aggregates will also help. So that's it. Here's my contact information. We have a lot more information available on our website, and I'll be glad to answer any more questions we may have at the end.